the Chinese were big targets in that part of the United States. On the West Coast, many people were fearing their influx to the western part of the country. And based upon very little evidence, they were singled out and they were made to be the test case for the first execution. Yui Singh got off. The other man, Russell, who was Mexican-American, at the very last minute, he got off, also for a murder. And it's important to keep in mind that General Freeze, who I mentioned as being the head of the Chemical Warfare Service and a big promoter of this gas chamber business, was also one of the leaders in the country of immigrant restriction, anti-immigrant stuff. Establishing quotas, keeping out the Chinese, keeping out Jews, keeping out people from Eastern Europe that he did not want coming into the country, anybody of color. And Mexicans as well. He'd also fought in some border war with Mexico and did not have warm feelings toward the Mexicans. So it was no coincidence that of these first suspects, given the murders that went on in the state, members of these groups were singled out and they were put on the chopping block early on. And unfortunately, that's always been the case, hasn't it, with regard to the death penalty? Still is. These are the people that get executed, whoever at that time is on the shit list. And so that's what happened to Guy John. There was a bit of an outcry over the fact that this racism pervaded the whole capital punishment machinery, and people complained about that, but it didn't really prevail. Now, maybe there was another part of your question that I didn't. Oh, how I sort of relate to this? How does it relate to today? Well, we see a lot of the same kinds of things going on through this. And as I was sort of reflecting a little bit about, what to say about this book, because there's a lot of stuff in the book. I wrote it, right around the election time. And although I wasn't following too closely, I'm just in the air, you feel things. You feel things going on. You get the sense of what's happening in this society. And every once in a while, I'd walk into the kitchen and I'd see somebody, saying the kinds of things that they're saying about, what they're going to do when they get power and all. And it certainly is affecting some of my remarks tonight, just as over the course of the last few years as I was working on this, I thought that even though this is a forgotten American execution method, and although nobody has related it to the Holocaust, which is this elephant in the room with regard to the gas chamber, it's something that I think people need to know about and to understand how the military-industrial complex is tied up in all of this, capital punishment, how the industrial sector has been involved, the scientific sector was involved in this, and many of these issues which run through this story and this book are still with us today. And they are these demons that we are grappling with as a society. And we have to understand that as we confront some of these things, a lot of people before us confronted them. And there's a lot that we can learn from that experience. So I hope that people get something from it and understand that this is a book about the death penalty. We all have to be concerned about the death penalty. But it is about other things that don't exactly seem to be the death penalty, but you know, the Holocaust was the death penalty. Lynching was the death penalty. And I always say that in this country, before around 1900, the predominant way that people were executed in the United States was lynching. That was the way it was done. It wasn't that long ago. So we have to remember these things. And I urge everybody to work with David and others to try to fashion alternatives to some of these horrors and to work at some of the root causes that contribute to this violence. Not just the violence that is committed by the alleged criminals, but the violence that's committed by the state. The violence that's committed by the perpetrators of capital punishment. Because that's the greatest violence.
First of all, Scott, I really want to thank you for this work, and
Thank you.
The ritual of you taking the stone from Nevada and bringing it to you really is very moving to me. So thank you. My question is, and I know you've been involved in anti-capitalist punishment work for some time, but how did you get intrigued by this particular question? Or did you start in another direction and this emerged? And could you talk a little bit about the process of doing this research and how long you've been on this?
Well, I've worked on the death penalty since the early 1970s, and I wrote some of the first articles about lethal injection back when it was being proposed and enacted in the United States. And I wrote a book on the electric chair and about executions, and I did a lot of things for the History Channel and other TV about the electric chair. And in the course of doing some of those, Nazi use of the gas chambers could not have come as much of a surprise to certain key American policymakers and war merchants. In fact, some of them had worked for years with the German industrial conglomerate IG Farben, with Degussa and Degesch, and other German makers of Zyklon B and other poisons. They knew what their product would do. They knew what was going on. The book cites a number of American chemical companies that were part of the cyanide cartel. Among them, Roessler and Haslacher of New York, DuPont, and American Cyanamid. Agents for DuPont, for example, communicated with IG Farben by secret code. And the two kept each other informed about what they were doing, in some instances, even during the war, through secret channels in Basel, Switzerland. This kind of corporate intelligence was often better than the military's. Insiders within IG Farben and other key German military contractors, for instance, knew exactly what the Nazis were doing, even before they did it. One example I mentioned in the book and highlight in my film involves a German economist, Erwin Respondek, who learned about Hitler's plans to invade the Soviet Union, even before Hermann Goering did. Respondek secretly alerted British and American spies who warned FDR, who warned Stalin. But Stalin didn't believe them until it was too late. Executives inside DuPont and Farben and other key corporations knew very well about the effects of hydrogen cyanide gas and gas executions, even before the Nazis started gassing prisoners, because they knew all about the American gas chambers and their use of hydrogen cyanide. The daughter of former DuPont president Alfred DuPont had married a German, and they had sons in the SS who kept her apprised. Among the top American big shots who had worked in league with Farben and assisted American financiers in bankrolling the rise to power of both Mussolini and Hitler was John J. McCloy, the New York lawyer who would later serve as Assistant Secretary of War during World War II, later become High Commissioner over West Germany, was first president of the World Bank, a member of the Warren Commission. Today, historians count McCloy as the most influential private citizen of the 20th century. McCloy is often remembered for his refusal to bomb Auschwitz death camp. And historians continue to bicker over whether that decision was justified on military grounds. He's also criticized for his lenient treatment of Nazi war criminals after the war. My book points out that McCloy also had a long personal and professional involvement with both chemical warfare and Farben. His German-American father-in-law, Frederick Zinsser, operated a plant in Hastings-on-Hudson that was contracted to make mustard gas. Zinsser also helped run the chemical warfare services Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. McCloy's wife's uncle popularized the notion that typhus was spread by lice and could be eradicated by cyanide fumigation, something that Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels later used against the so-called Jewish vermin. McCloy's brother-in-law, Lewis Douglas, bolted from FDR's cabinet and tried to unseat Roosevelt. An outspoken anti-Semite, Douglas supported fascism early on and also served as vice president of American Cyanamid, which manufactured Zyklon B and other poisons as part of the cartel with Farben. McCloy had actually represented Farben before the war and negotiated with the Nazi state. He had sat with Goering and other Nazis in Hitler's box during the 1936 Olympics. Historians need to assess whether these factors may have influenced McCloy's decisions not to bomb Farben's assets, just as this may have prompted him to pull strings that kept the U.S. government from penalizing DuPont, American Cyanamid, and other indicted corporations for trading with the enemy, and just as he later helped to suppress post-war punishment of German and American war profiteers. It was McCloy who secured the appointment of Konrad Adenauer as West Germany's first federal chancellor. Adenauer, who was cousin to McCloy's wife and Lou Douglas's spouse. By the way, the Sterling Drug and Winthrop Chemical Company in Rensselaer was identified as one of the Nazi-controlled assets of Bayer and IG Farben. A number of Gestapo agents had ties to the plant, which was finally seized by the U.S. government, and a couple of its board members were later tried at Nuremberg for war crimes. As Allied troops liberated the former Nazi death camps, graphic proof about the gas chambers and crematoria shocked the world. But the ties of American and British chemical firms and other corporations to the Nazis was effectively covered up. The Nuremberg trials and other tribunals carefully avoided the subject, and there was no mention made of gassings in the U.S. or anything of that sort. For decades after the Nuremberg Tribunal, as many as 11 states continued to retain lethal gas as their official method of execution. But after the Holocaust, gassing lost its legitimacy. The famous case of Carol Chessman in California attracted worldwide attention for more than a decade up until his execution in 1960.